Gun control activist David Hogg gets a leadership position in the Democratic Party. Plus, Trump's Attorney General tells the ATF to prioritize firearms enforcement. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. To kick us off this week, one of the big stories that came down was the results of the Democratic National Committee and their election of new leadership to replace, obviously outgoing party chair Jamie Harrison and replace some of the vice chairs. And one of those vice chairs that was tapped was none other than gun control activist David Hogg. So I think that's pretty symbolic, probably an unusual choice, but it also symbolic, as you discussed in a members piece as well, about what that says as the party is considering its future.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess he's the youngest person to win that position. So certainly a substantial development in the Democratic Party, one that I think gives you insight into where the National Party, at least, is at on guns, which is that they're staying to the left. And if anything, they've moved this would perhaps signal they've moved a bit further to the left on gun policy, at least rhetorically. Obviously the Harris campaign on policy was among the most aggressive in history. So, I don't know if the policy side is shifting much there. It's certainly not shifting back towards the center or right. But rhetorically, they did at least try to make some inroads with gun owners on a sort of surface level, talking about Harris's and Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate's gun ownership. And he did a whole hunting event. She talked about owning a Glock and how if somebody broke into her house, they'd get shot. These weren't policy appeals, but they were rhetorical surface level appeals of trying to relate to gun owners. And so elevating David Hogg, who is almost exclusively known for his gun control activism, and the bombastic nature of it. This is somebody who is cursing out gun owners and gun rights activists on a regular basis, and calling for all sorts of gun bans and telling people who don't agree with him that they should leave the Democratic Party. I think the signal is pretty straightforward there. He's just one of three vice chairs, sure. But they elevated him, and that's what he's known for. So it's pretty fair to take away this is where the party is at today. Now, he is young as well, and a sort of a progressive activist beyond guns to some degree. But so I'm sure that played a role as well. But he's primarily known for this. He survived the Parkland shooting and became a very active and staunch gun control activist, helped found March for Our Lives, which is one of the further left gun control groups on the national scene. And so him getting a role in party leadership sends a signal. And so does, not the only thing too, right? So does the fact that Democrats have not been eager to join any of these pro-gun bills that have been introduced by Republicans in the new Congress. There's at least 5 sort of pro-gun bills that have been introduced since the beginning of this new Congress. And among those 5, only one has any Democratic co-sponsors at this point. And that one only has a single Democratic sponsor. Jared Golden from Maine is the only Democrat in either body to co-sponsor any of these pro-gun bills at this point. So, that taken together gives you an indication of where the Democratic Party is today in the wake of their loss in the 2024 election. Clearly, they don't think gun policy is where they went wrong. And if anything, they may be delving even further to the left on the issue, if these early moves are any indication. So that's an interesting dynamic to watch unfold because it's pretty different from how they've reacted on other issues. Certainly, there's been, the Elon Musk and everything going on at USAID and throughout the rest of the federal government, the FBI, places like that, has kind of shifted the dynamic post-election to put Democrats back on a more resistance to Trump footing than they were in the immediate aftermath of the election. But the very first thing Congress did when it got back into session was pass an immigration bill, the Lincoln-Riley Act, which saw a significant amount of Democratic support, which was a reversal from when it had previously been introduced. So you had, I think, 12 Democratic senators and several dozen House members vote for that bill, which did pass and was signed. And like a sign that they had moved on the issue after losing the election. And so you're not seeing that same sort of movement on gun policy. And so, I think that says quite a bit. And yes, the sort of chaotic moment that we're in with everything else going on in government outside of gun policy has, I think, shifted the dynamics for Democrats to where they're politically, they feel more pressured from their own base to not cooperate with Republicans and Donald Trump at this point. But so that may play into it as well. But regardless, it doesn't appear that Democrats are looking at gun policy as an area where they that cost them this last election.
Yeah, that to me is what sticks out about it, is just the symbolic nature of post the loss. Obviously, last November, you saw all sorts of recriminations from donors and then party leaders and party members talking about. Well, clearly, our messaging is out of touch with at least the working class that flock to Donald Trump and the Republicans in that race, and maybe middle America as well. So we need to rethink our stance on all sorts of these social issues. You saw immigration, sort of LGBT issues came up a lot. But it's funny that guns, like you said, doesn't appear to be one of those issues. And like you said, David Hogg, as a vice chair, it's not clear how much sway he's going to have over, setting the tempo for the party's stance on guns and how much influence he really has. But symbolically, at least, it sure right. Sends a message as to where they plan to head on that issue. So, yeah, absolutely. It's impossible to not see it that way. Right. Just the nature of David Hogg and how aggressive and bombastic he has been as one of the top gun control advocates in the country since the Parkland shooting. Putting someone like that in a leadership position in the party, I mean, hard to imagine they're going to shift back towards the center or on guns after doing that. But we'll see, I guess. Yeah, we'll have to see how it plays out. But sort of on the other side, related to gun politics, we have a pair of stories about Pam Bondi, Trump's nominee to be the Attorney General. She was officially confirmed. So she is now the Attorney General. And she's already, at least some of her first moves in that position, have influenced guns a little bit, at least related to the agency that regulates firearms. Yeah. So Bondi got through, as we expected, with full Republican support, and without ever having been asked to disavow any of her positions on stricter gun control when she was Attorney General in Florida. So probably not a great sign for the political strength of the gun rights movement. And also, you probably would notice that the gun control groups, while they did put out statements opposing her along the way, didn't make much of a stink about her being confirmed.
they probably think she's the best they're going to get from a Trump administration. But so we'll see how she actually governs, and we'll see if gun rights groups have any sway over what she does as Attorney General, where she's going to have a lot of control over how the federal government approaches gun policy, especially enforcement of current gun laws and defending them in court and running the ATF, things like that. And speaking of which, as you mentioned, she put out a memo. She did kind of the Trump thing, right? Where she unloaded like 15 day one memos trying to shift DOJ policy. And one of those included a new policy towards the ATF, where it's only a paragraph, so it's not exactly fleshed out policy, but it basically tells the ATF to stop doing the A and T parts of their job. It essentially says to shift resources away from alcohol and tobacco enforcement toward other priorities that she'd laid out in this memo of what the Trump administration's top priorities are, including things like drug trafficking and immigration enforcement and somewhat ironically protecting law enforcement from attacks, even though Trump had pardoned a bunch of people who attacked law enforcement during the January 6th riots, early on in his presidency here. But, one area she told them not to shift resources away from was firearms licensing and background check routines. So, I don't know what that's going to look like in practice exactly, but because it's really just a paragraph in this one memo that just says the ATF should shift resources away from alcohol and tobacco enforcement. But, I guess the takeaway there is that they're not shifting resources away from firearms law enforcement. So this actually, I found a piece after I wrote this story. I did find a piece from 2018 about how the Trump administration the first time around had considered doing this. And that piece fleshed out the idea a bit more. And New York Times wrote up a whole long story on the idea that they were going to try and do exactly this, shift resources away from alcohol and tobacco enforcement, probably move that back to Treasury and, keep the ATF focused on just firearms enforcement. And, in the story, at least, they made it seem as though this was perhaps not as big of a shift as it might seem on the surface, because obviously the agency is called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. So you assume that they do a lot of the alcohol and tobacco part of that. But in practice, the actual law enforcement aspect of the alcohol and tobacco stuff is more about smuggling. Sort of back to the roots, I guess, of the agency from the 1930s, when, alcohol smuggling and was a bigger problem in the United States. And so, whether or not this is a huge shakeup is, I think, an open question. Also, like what exactly it means in practice. That 2018 story, described them sort of restructuring the agency and moving those enforcement prerogatives to, Treasury instead of the ATF. And they described it as kind of just cementing what had been going on inside the agency already anyway. They don't focus on these priorities that much to begin with. So, I don't want to make a huge deal out of it. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a massive shift in what the ATF would be doing if they follow through on this. But, But, there's not a lot of detail from this first memo. She did promise to send future memos to outline more of what's going on here. So we'll have to wait and see what exactly that looks like. But it would basically leave an agency that is almost exclusively dealing with firearms regulation and enforcement. So, how people feel about that will be remains to be seen. But
yeah,
it's kind of the exact opposite of what you've seen, especially online, a lot of gun rights activists asking for, which is, either to abolish the ATF altogether, especially mainly the firearms part, or, shrink it and move it under Treasury or what have you. So in that regard, it's definitely not what I think gun rights activists have been looking for on this front.
Yeah, like you said, it's not enough to draw sweeping conclusions, but I think it does speak to why maybe perhaps you saw some gun groups like Gun Owners of America and National Association for Gun Rights expressing a little bit of discomfort with her pick, and why as you mentioned, gun control groups. I mean, they said some things, but they didn't really fight this, tooth and claw, this nomination, because she is sort of a traditionalist. She's sort of signaled that she's going to be a traditional law and order type. That's what she's looking for at the ATF. She wants them to enforce sort of their law enforcement responsibilities, and in this case, specifically to firearms. And it kind of tracks with her history, like as state attorney general. We've covered her background. Obviously, she was okay with certain gun control laws and defended them pretty vigorously in Florida courts, the post-Parkland gun control measures.
Red flag laws and age restrictions. She back, and then, several other, I think some of the carry laws she was vigorous in defending in court, and that got her in trouble with the NRA and other gun control or gun rights groups at the time, which actually is sort of another thing that we'll want to watch for with Bondi now being AG, is how is she going to handle federal gun rights challenges? For instance, there's a case right now at the Supreme Court, Banderstock, over the Biden administration's their so-called ghost gun rule, their frames and receivers rule. And, we covered oral arguments when those happened in October, and the court sure seems to be leaning towards upholding that regulation. We don't know for sure. Obviously, we just have what they said in oral arguments. That doesn't always translate to exactly what happens in the opinion, but there's been no action taken on that front to try and, maybe moot the case before you get a ruling. That's something I've seen gun rights activists complain about, that Trump administration could possibly try to do by, for instance, beginning the withdrawal of the rule. We talked about this. You covered this, actually wrote a good piece on this a little while back, that not something that he could do immediately, or you can't just write an executive order that says I rescind this rule. You have to go through the rulemaking process all over again. But he could start that process, and maybe that may be something that the Supreme Court decides is enough to moot this case and prevent, a ruling that upholds the frames and receivers rule from the Biden administration. But we haven't seen that happen. And then, there's going to be a lot of potential for situations where DOJ stops defending certain gun laws. If they, that is something they can do. They have done it in the past. The Trump administration did this the first time around in some cases where they stopped defending the law because they argued they didn't have a viable path to defend it, the constitutionality of the law. So, they could take that tact with some gun laws. I'm sure not all of them, but we'll see if they do that at all with any of them. But, those are the things where Bondi, and she's likely to have a lot of influence over who becomes the ATF director, whether in an acting role or if Trump decides to nominate a permanent director. She's likely going to have his ear. The reporting we've heard from New York Times, at least, indicates that she wants a law enforcement official to do that instead of, somebody with more of an activist background, like Biden picked in his term. David Shipman and Stephen Dettelbach were definitely much closer, much more on the politicized activist side of the coin than, I mean, they had law enforcement backgrounds, to be fair, but they were picked much more because they also had a background of advocating for stricter gun laws. So that's something a lot of gun rights advocates want to see, but flipped around, right? They want somebody like Brandon Herrera or Blake Nassers has been floated for this role, or there's any number of sort of pro-gun academics, maybe you have a better understanding of the agency itself and how it works, that could fill that role. But it has traditionally gone to law enforcement. Law enforcement officials, people from within the agency itself, and also, that maybe where Bondi wants to bring it back to. So we'll have to see what happens with that, because Trump has not given any indication of what he's going to do, whether he's even going to try to put in a permanent director. I wrote a piece on that a little while ago as well, whether it's even going to be worth it to him politically to do that, especially given the history of permanent directors. It costs a lot of political capital to get them confirmed, and they tend to only serve like a couple years at most. Dettelbach only served 2 years. I think the last one before him only served 2 years as well. So, how much are they really getting accomplished in that time? I don't know. But either way, there's a lot to watch for with Bondi and how she runs federal gun policy as Attorney General coming up here.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, be keeping on top of that as it unfolds now that she's officially in the position to have an influence like that. Mm-hmm. But speaking of gun laws in court, we had a pretty sizable district court ruling. This one out of the District of Mississippi, a judge that should be familiar to a lot of folks that follow this sort of stuff because he's done this a number of times. Yeah. Judge Carlton Reeves, in a criminal case, struck down the federal machine gun ban as it relates to a particular defendant. So this isn't like a sweeping nationwide injunction or anything, but he tossed the charges against this man because he said it doesn't, the Second Amendment protects this stuff, or at least bringing charges against him for this would violate the Second Amendment. So that's pretty big.
Yeah. And this is sort of one of those cases, I guess, that DOJ could decline the appeal or decline to defend the law. I think it's a very unlikely candidate for that, frankly, because I would be very surprised if Trump and Bondi decided they wanted to get rid of the machine gun ban. But yeah, essentially, you've seen Reeves has been very consistent on this. He's done a surprising number of these gun cases since Bruen. This is like his fourth one, right? He's been very true to giving the defendants in these Bruen-inspired cases the proper deference that Bruen requires. Because Bruen, remember, kind of one of the biggest things about Bruen is that it shifts the burden onto the government to prove that their gun laws are constitutional rather than on the defendant to prove that they're unconstitutional. And so that burden shift is very significant and, in theory, at least ought to help defendants quite a lot in these kinds of cases. And, it hasn't always. There's a lot of judges have kind of, they've accepted things like Supreme Court dicta or what have you as good enough to uphold something like the machine gun ban. But Reeves has not done that, and Reeves has been. I think he's definitely taken the sort of Thomas view of what Bruen says and how that standard is supposed to work. Thomas obviously dissented in Rahimi as complaining that the rest of the court was being too loose in its interpretation of Bruen. And I don't think you could say that of Reeves. he's definitely been he's gone across the board on these. He tossed charges against somebody who was a convicted felon of a violent felony of manslaughter over a bar fight. From decades earlier, this guy had served his time and was, I think, a relatively old man at this point that he was charged with felon in possession. But, that's something you haven't seen a lot of, federal judges throwing out felon in possession charges against violent felons. We've seen nonviolent felons win a number of those cases, but not as many on the violent felony side. But he took the view that there wasn't a historical analog to match a lifetime ban, even after somebody has served their sentence. So he's been also illegal immigrants, people in the country without legal status. He threw out charges against somebody for possessing firearms in that scenario under similar logic of there wasn't a historical analog for something like that, the national law on that. And now, he's gotten to the machine gun case. And this is an interesting case because the defendant himself, literally all he did was possess this unregistered machine gun. So he didn't have any sort of other criminal background or wasn't charged with anything in addition to just possessing this unregistered machine gun. So he's a pretty good test subject for a case like this. And that was basically the determination that he went through and did the Bruin test. And honestly, it was almost more of a Heller test because the standard he was judging against was that, these firearms are in common use. This is one thing that may be particularly substantial and influential going forward from this case, is that he kind of set up, he put a number to common use, which was, I think, 740,000. That's the number of registered fully automatic firearms in the ATF's National Firearms Act data registry. So, it's a lot. Although it's a lot less than like semi-automatic handguns, which is what Heller was talking about as far as common use. Certainly a lot less as well than, AR-15s or something like that. So, it certainly you have a federal judge here fleshing out what exactly common use means. We've seen, because the Supreme Court has never put a number on it, right? You had Satanu, where they said that, where the implication of that ruling, the 2-page per curiam ruling in that case, was that stun guns are in common use, although the actual ruling was more about the fact that stun guns are modern weapons which are still protected by the Second Amendment, despite not existing at the founding era. It wasn't really about common use, but presumably to be protected, they'd have to be in common use. And you had an Alito concurrence in that case where he estimated there was like 250,000 of them. And a lot of people point to that. A lot of people wrongly point to that as the Supreme Court setting a number, but it was just a concurrence from one justice who said this. You can maybe extrapolate that to the rest of the court, but they didn't actually say that in the ruling. So, it's just that's one area where this is, I think, potentially influential, is he sets a number that at least, 750,000 is common. And then he says, because the government had claimed that a dangerous and unusual exception here, like, machine guns can be banned because they're dangerous and unusual. And he said, well, they're dangerous, sure, but so are revolvers and semi-automatic handguns, and those things have been found to be protected by the Second Amendment. The problem is they're not unusual, and the government didn't. This is another thing, he kind of chastised the government a lot. You see this in some of these post-Bruin cases where the government doesn't really try to meet its obligations. Like I said, they're supposed to be the ones who have to prove that the law is constitutional under this Bruin framework. And sometimes they're kind of lazy about it. And they're just kind of expecting the judge to side with them regardless. And that's how this case felt. And this judge isn't willing to do that. So, because they relied a lot on pre-Bruen precedents that the judge said are no longer valid. And then they didn't provide, like, they didn't try to dispute the number of machine guns in circulation. They didn't try to offer their own estimate, and they didn't try to dispute that the 740,000 number would put it in common use. So, but either way, yeah, the end result is the charges against this guy in Mississippi were dropped. It's not technically an injunction against the law, so the law can still be enforced. Though the more of these as applied rulings you get on a law like this, the less sure any prosecutor can be that they'll win a case, at least in these circumstances, right? At least in that circuit. So it does matter. And also, of course, the government could appeal. That perhaps I would say it's likely they will appeal. Again, this could be something where the new administration might have some say in what happens here. But, I don't think the federal government wants a ruling against the machine gun ban to stand. But we'll have to see exactly what transpires from here out.
Yeah, a couple interesting things on that is that this is the second district court ruling I'm aware of that strikes down the machine gun ban. I wrote about the first a couple months back. It was out of Kansas, similar situation. It was a criminal case. And to your point about what the government chooses to do with appeals that maybe gun rights advocates might be looking for is that Kansas case. If the government appeals, then Kansas is covered by the 10th Circuit, which is sort of liberal. It's almost down the middle, but sort of liberal leaning circuit. So you can sort of bet that they're not going to want to let a pro machine gun ruling stand. This one is the 5th Circuit, where if there was going to be a circuit that was going to uphold the ruling strike, it's by no means a guarantee. I don't want to say the 5th Circuit is pro machine gun or whatever, but I think that's something worth watching as well. And just one more note about Judge Reeves, sort of your point about him doing this consistently. He's one of these judges we've seen post Bruen that clearly is not a fan of the court's Second Amendment jurisprudence. Oh, yeah. He takes time in every one of these rulings to talk about how concerned he is with it, how unworkable he thinks the standard is. It's almost sort of like I'm being forced to do this. You leave me no choice. And he makes these sort of splashy rulings saying this is the absurd standard you set, but I must faithfully apply it. And it's almost like he chooses to do the most attention grabbing cases because, like you said, it's violent felon possession being struck down, immigration struck down, machine gun. It's all these laws that tend to be the most headline grabbing that he strikes down. So I just think that's interesting and worth noting with these Reeves cases.
Absolutely. I mean, that's another aspect of this story that is interesting because Reeves is not a fan of Bruen by any stretch. And, he even quotes Jake Charles, the professor that we've had on the show a number of times, who is also a Bruen critic, is saying that basically the Bruen will inevitably lead to lots of confusion in the lower courts. And, but at the end of the day, he claims that, he has to follow this precedent. This is what judges are supposed to do, right? Even if they don't like the precedent. So, you could certainly look at it as kind of a malicious compliance and maybe trying to call the Supreme Court's bluff. Because that's another thing, like the Supreme Court on this issue, it's definitely not a guarantee that they would rule the same way as Reeves has here. Right. Even if you can look at Bruen and agree with Reeves' analysis of it in this situation, or Heller, really. I mean, honestly, the core of this is more Heller than Bruen, because Heller is what's really established that common use standard for protected firearms. But, in Heller, the Supreme Court goes out of its way to talk about how in dicta, at least, that, meaning it's not part of the binding precedent, it's not part of the actual holding of the case. It's just something where the court is sort of explaining its thought process. They go out of their way to talk about how M16s, which are fully automatic, machine guns, wouldn't be covered, or it's okay to ban them. And so, and this is kind of goes to some degree with what Thomas's complaint was in Rahimi, of like, it's not, the court handed down this standard that seems fairly strict and fairly difficult to meet for modern gun laws, but it's really not clear that they're willing to actually go all the way to striking down most of those modern prohibitions. We've talked about this a lot in the past. Like the Supreme Court has not front run public opinion on guns to this point, right? Heller basically struck down the last couple, Heller and McDonald struck down like the last two remaining handgun bans in the country, well after handgun bans fell out of popularity with the American public. And the same thing for Bruin. Bruin struck down, half a dozen or so gun carry laws that, they did, to be fair, they were in very populous states like California and New York, but there had already been a popular movement to undo those sorts of gun carry restrictions in the vast majority of the country by the time the Supreme Court actually went in and issued an opinion on the legality of restricting gun carry to the degree that New York was doing it. And so, they've never front run public opinion on guns, and they have the standard they have, but there's also, I think, practical and political considerations when you look at what the Supreme Court actually might do in a case. You can look at the standard they handed down and you can say, well, this law, like Reeves was right according to the Bruin and Heller standards. This, outside of like quibbling over what exactly is common use, like how many guns do you have to have for it to be in common use? But, if it gets to the Supreme Court, I wouldn't be confident that they would actually take this view. And so he may be doing these things as a way of saying like, all right, well, yeah, sure. This is what I think your standard leads to. And I don't think you'll actually go this far.
Yeah.
I don't know. You'd have to get into his head. Obviously he doesn't like the standard. He says he's doing it this way because he has to, because he's bound by the standard. And that is right. That's what judges are supposed to do. He's an Obama appointee, by the way. But some people will look at that and say he's trying to like, thumb his nose at the court by aggressively complying with their standard in a way that perhaps they wouldn't even do.
Right. No, it's a good point. Getting into some of the newsletter links that we've got this week, we have an interesting one from Reuters talking about Trump's nominee to lead the Department of Commerce, Howard Lutnick. And evidently, this is one of the first times we've actually heard affirmative gun policy ideas from some of these nominees. And he claims that he's going to go back and revisit the old Biden executive order dealing with firearms exports. That obviously was a policy we covered during the previous administration. And so it's interesting to hear a nominee actually say something about gun policy.
Yeah. A significant thing too. I mean, the first Trump administration was the one that moved gun export control from, I think it was the State Department to the Treasury, right? I believe. Anyway, they moved it from one executive agency to another, and then the Biden administration kind of tried to use the new agency to put restrictions on exports, as we reported at the time, to kind of strangle off exports to certain countries of certain kinds of guns, including some of our allies like Israel and Ukraine, and so. Is sort of a way of they did soften exactly what they were doing through the process after we reported on a leaked version of the rule, but yeah, they still sort of trying to implement a type of gun control for other countries through our export laws. So it'll be interesting to see, if the Trump administration reverses a bunch of that. Of course, you have at the same time the president threatening a lot of tariffs and trade wars with different countries that probably could have an impact on another negative impact on the gun export and import industry for sure. I think there's a number of ammo companies make their ammo overseas and even in Mexico. So, we'll have to see how that all ends up shaking out, whether, if they reduce some of these regulations on imports and exports, but then slap tariffs on the countries that you do business with as far as, firearms exporting goes, it's probably not going to be a net positive in the end, but it is, there's certainly notable to hear him say that. And it is one of the rare times we've seen a Trump nominee addressing something at least the gun industry is very interested in. So
Right.
definitely notable.
Another story we want to talk about comes to us from the Daily Beast, and it's also sort of an update on what we've reported in the past. This has to deal with Meta and its sort of reforming of its content moderation practices. And what it says is it's allowing free speech on its platforms. Evidently, Donald Trump Jr. met with Meta through his Field Ethos, I think is the name of his sort of hunting and firearms lifestyle brand. It was through that he was meeting with folks from Meta to try to get clarity on how they're going to approach firearms content. And evidently, according to them, at least, Meta was receptive and said that they would treat firearms content as they're supposed to, according to their terms of content moderation, which should hopefully crack down on the sort of the shadow banning stuff that a lot of gun rights people and firearms content creators have complained about for so long over the last few years.
Yeah. And it seems relatively believable. I think there was a Facebook official who tweeted acknowledging the meeting as well. So honestly, not really a big ask. You've seen a lot of these billionaires and social media companies kind of groveling at Trump's after Trump's election here. So this would be a pretty simple thing to do, to just comply with their own terms as far as it relates to gun businesses. So I don't, it seems like a believable claim to me. Because we've seen Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and all sorts of social media companies crack down on gun content in ways that weren't laid out in their content guidelines, right? And that's been one of the biggest issues that we've covered with this sort of with these social media companies. And so, meeting with Trump Jr. and telling him, we're not gonna make these sort of errors in the future, because it wasn't that long ago where they turned off Smith & Wesson's Facebook page, right? And then when we inquired about it, they turned it back on and said it was a mistake. And that is a very common story that we've seen over the last several years at these social media companies, where there'll be something that impacts, gun creators or gun companies that where they don't seem to have done anything to violate the terms of service, and yet they're being suspended or even, deleted off the platform, or given, channel strikes on YouTube, things like that. And then once people complain about it, or even honestly, a lot of times once we ask them about this stuff, I mean, we've had it happen several times at YouTube and Facebook, where once we send like a press inquiry, then maybe become, when they actually become aware of what's going on within their own systems, they reverse themselves and say it was a mistake. So, I don't know how they're going to fix that, because it seems to me a lot of these problems tend to stem from not necessarily like overzealous rules, although those certainly exist and are an issue in and of themselves, but more like moderation mistakes because of the way these companies build their moderation systems, which is like they have so much content being posted on places like Facebook and YouTube every day that there's no way they can actually practically moderate all of it. Certainly not with people who have brains to think about what the heck they're doing. And so instead they use, algorithms to try and flag things that they don't want on their platform. And oftentimes that leads to a lot of false flagging of this content. And then even sometimes you'll get sort of there's like the algorithm level, then there's like the minimum wage overseas worker moderation level. That's the next step. And then, there's layers to these moderation systems at these big companies. And you'll see the problems arise from those first 2 or 3 layers of like the silencer issue that YouTube had a while back, where someone somewhere got the impression that their content guidelines didn't allow you to, I guess it seemed like at least, didn't allow you to screw on or screw off suppressors from guns, because that's a form of, modifying a gun, which is not allowed to be shown on YouTube. Now, that's this case where both the policy itself is fairly questionable about like manufacturing or showing how to put together, an AR-15 lower is not allowed necessarily under the content policy. And then the content policy is taken and misunderstood by the lower level moderation people and applied in a way that puts at risk a ton of gun tubers who make their living off of the platform. And so that's what I tend to see in these cases. One, a lot of the actual content policies on guns are pretty incomprehensible and written by people who don't really understand firearms to begin with. And then 2, usually, honestly, the bigger problem ends up being inconsistent and mistaken application of these rules in ways that get like Smith & Wesson taken off of Facebook, even though it'd certainly be hard to imagine that they actually violated Facebook's gun content. Facebook basically just doesn't let you sell guns directly on their platform. And Smith & Wesson doesn't directly sell guns to anybody. So it wouldn't make much sense that they would have violated that. They sell through wholesalers who sell to retailers, right? So, I wouldn't be surprised if Facebook made some sort of promise to Donald Trump Jr., especially, Mark Zuckerberg's the way that he's been sucking up to Trump lately. This is a pretty small ask to just, hey, why don't you properly enforce your actual rules? This is a thing where you just have to keep watching and keep vigilant about what's going on, because just because they tell one company that this is what they're going to do, like I said, I mean, they may not even want to do that, but they're oftentimes these moderation systems just they don't work that well, frankly. They don't really have the capacity to properly moderate the content on their website. That's why I know a lot of gun people complain about this, understandably, but you can look at a site like YouTube and see they're not even good at moderating things that everybody thinks shouldn't be on there, like creepy, sexualized cartoons for children. There was a big scandal about that, like Spider-Man getting Elsa pregnant, like gibberish stuff that's also like weirdly sexual. They've had a lot of scandals over the years about all kinds of extremely objectionable content that's not allowed under their terms of service, but they're bad at moderating. They're bad at seeing it and removing it. And so, this is kind of a symptom of a larger problem with these major platforms. It's just they don't have they don't actually really have the capacity to moderate themselves, even on topics where basically everyone is going to agree that shouldn't be allowed, So I think that's the larger symptom personally. But it means that whatever Facebook might say, and they always they kind of always say this, right? They always come out and be like, oh, well, this was a mistake. We didn't mean this. We don't, whatever. Sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes they did mean to make a change, or they claim that they made a change and hadn't been enforcing it properly. That was the last time we did a story on YouTube, right? The link policy. They claim that, saying a link in a video is also banned, not just putting one in a link to, any site that sells firearms or magazines, that can't be allowed. They claim that, oh, well, this also applies to spoken links in your videos when they hadn't been enforcing that for years. It does depend, but I think even in a scenario where they want to loosen their approach to gun content, or at least do a better job of applying their rules faithfully, it's going to be hard for them to actually pull that off in practice because of the way these systems work in real life. So we'll see. We're not going to just stop writing about this stuff just because Facebook claims they're not going to have problems with this anymore. But it is, it's still something, because Facebook wouldn't. Remember, they announced they were making a bunch of content moderation changes after the election in a pretty transparent attempt to curry favor with Trump. And this was one of the things we asked about, like, are you changing your gun policy? And they wouldn't say anything to us. Right. So I guess they've said something to Trump Jr. now.
Yeah, we'll have to see. And the last link we want to hit before we wrap up today comes from us from the Colorado Sun. Just a update on another Colorado gun bill that's making its way through the legislature. They are now trying to raise the age to purchase ammunition to 21. They've already raised, last year they raised the age to purchase a firearm in general, any firearm, to 21. Now they're trying to do the same with any kind of ammo. And they also want to put other restrictions on retailers, like all ammo has to be locked up the way guns are at certain gun stores, and restrictions on firearm deliveries to your home. You have to show an ID and sign for a package if you get ammo delivered. But it's sort of part and parcel with the big, obviously, gun push again in Colorado that's going on. Obviously, the semi-auto ban, the what they say is the magazine enforcement bill, is also still making its way through the Senate. Interestingly, that bill has been laid over multiple times. It was supposed to come up for its first floor vote in the Senate last Friday. They pushed it to this Friday, which is as we're recording today. And word is that they're delaying it once again. So there's all sorts of questions about whether the big support it appeared to have is actually holding or not. Because it seems, at least there's some rumors that there's some defections among some of the original supporters of the bill.
Oh, well, that's definitely interesting. We'll have to keep an eye on it. I mean, obviously they've tried and failed to pass bills like this in the past. Although you'd written about some of the differences this time around, including the support of a major Democrat in this whole effort. So, this would imagine it's probably not going away super easy. There'll be right. I'm sure they'll have a big fight over it. But yeah, make sure, of course, you will be keeping your eye on it. We have a similar situation here in Virginia, where there are a lot of gun control bills making their way through the democratically controlled legislature. But, whatever does get passed, it'll be interesting to see what our Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, ends up doing with them. Like, is he going to veto all of them or just some of them? That's something we'll also have to do some reporting on and figure out here. Because Virginia is another area where that could be a potential hotspot for gun policy, especially gun control, new gun restrictions this year or perhaps next year, because Virginia has off-year elections, right, like New Jersey. And it tends to be the case that the party that controls the presidency does poorly in the off-year election. And so we may end up in Virginia with a Democratic trifecta once again in the not too distant future, depending on, especially because our governors are term limited to one term. So you can't, or at least you can't serve 2 consecutive terms. So we'll see what happens on that front as well. But it's probably the fundamentals are shaping up poorly for Republicans in Virginia, and by extension for gun rights advocates, since they've been so closely connected to the Republican Party at this point. But yeah, we'll obviously we'll keep an eye on both of those. I think it's more likely that Colorado passes gun control legislation this year because they're already a Democratic trifecta. But exactly which ones they pass will be the real question.
Yeah, particularly these sweeping semi-auto bills. That's obviously why this one is going to be closely watched. And like you said, we'll stay on top of it as it works its way through the legislatures.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm back, by the way, from the Philippines, back here in Virginia. I wish I was still in the Philippines, to be frank. It was a wonderful trip. It was great meeting my fiance's family. They're wonderful to be around. I wish I was still there, honestly. I'm still a little bit, my sleep schedule's still a little messed up. So, I don't know. I think I'm just not going to bed when I should be, staying up scrolling, little doom scrolling going on. But yeah, it was a fantastic trip. I had a lot of fun. I'm hoping to go back again in the not too distant future. But hey, I've got, Michelle will be back. My fiance will be back in time for the Super Bowl, which features, in case anyone watching on YouTube wasn't aware, it features the Eagles, which I'm wearing an Eagles shirt and an Eagles hat for those of you listening on podcasting apps. And I'm pretty excited about that. Feel pretty good about that. We'll see. We'll see what happens. I think the Eagles are clearly a better team as far as talent goes, but that hasn't seemed to matter much for any of the games the Chiefs have played in this year, because I think they've almost all the teams they played have more talent other than at the quarterback position, and they still win. So who knows? But I'm looking forward to it. I think we're going to go up to Center City and watch the game there. And hopefully they'll win and we can party on Broad Street. We'll see. But I don't know. Who do you think? Who do you got for this?
I'm begrudgingly have to root for the Eagles as well. Yes. They're not my team, but I just cannot stand to see the Chiefs win again. So, I go
you
Birds.
Got to root for us. Yeah,
that's right.
That's right. You all have. That's it. You have to root for the Eagles. Nobody wants to see the Chiefs win again. My gosh, come on. But so yeah, that's been pretty funny to watch too. But yeah. Anyway, go Birds. And I'm gonna hand it off to myself to tell you guys a little bit about the Dispatch. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch, and so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news and it's focused on it. And I think it's fantastic, but they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here.
And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.